I think that's actually been a competitive advantage of ours. Not that we're competing with anyone, but from a guest experience perspective, to know that you can come on the podcast on like a Wednesday and then by Tuesday, the thing is live. In my experience, that's like an abnormal turnaround time for doing content. So if someone's listening and you're like, do I want to be on a podcast? Trust me, some podcasts you go on it. I've been on some podcasts like months ago that still haven't published.
Yeah.
Right.
No.
I don't know what they're doing, but it's not their priority to publish. And they're waiting, they're stockpiling content. And actually, this happened to me 2 years ago. I was on a podcast and it took 4 months for the episode to air, which is wild.
Yeah.
If you come on our podcast, the episode's going to be live the following week, guaranteed. Like that's like people can expect that. We don't mess around.
Welcome to another episode of Supra Insider. This time, Ben and I decided to spice things up a little bit. And instead of having a guest, we decided to take the time to reflect on what we've learned. We've already launched 11 episodes and we've hit some exciting milestones. We have over 500 subscribers, close to 2,000 downloads. So we thought it would be a good time to take a step back and reflect.
In our conversation, Mark and I talked about the early foundational decisions that we made, getting the podcast off the ground. Then we went into the learnings that we had, like very tactical tweaks we made to the podcast based on specific pieces of feedback, anywhere from adjusting the microphone that Mark uses all the way to playing with the things we ask guests about before we even hit record, and a lot of those adjustments we've made. And then we finished by talking about where we think the podcast is going to go from here, or at least some areas that we're both curious to explore in future experiments and tests. And I think we covered a bunch of ground, and I also hope this isn't the last time that we do this kind of podcast. We want to make this a regular occurrence at certain milestones as we keep going to share the learnings. I hope you enjoy this conversation and let us know what you thought. All right, we're live. Mark, I suggested the idea to you earlier. What if we just recorded an episode celebrating some of the progress, and we'll talk about what some of the numbers are with people if they're interested. But I think we've been doing this thing for a bit now, and just talk about what we've learned so far. I think we've been making changes pretty much every episode as far as I can tell, and also where we think we might want to go with it from here. But I think it's going to be a fun one, and maybe people will get some value out of it.
Yeah, I just love having a forcing function to take the time, reflect, see how things are going. And yeah, I think the side note that I'll make is that we still don't really know what we're doing. We just recorded 11 episodes. None of us had podcasting experience before we got started. We've learned a ton, but I still feel like we have a lot more to learn. So we're excited to share what we learned with you. And hopefully every quarter, once we do this, we'll have a new learning that you can action on or inspires you maybe to do something with it.
Yeah, I love that. The first decisions we really had to make were what kind of podcast did we want to create? What would be the general format? And then once we decided those things, we got into talking about the tools that we need. We started talking about timelines. We started talking about preparation. We started talking about, is this like a guest show or is this like something else? So yeah, what are the first kind of learnings or decisions that you feel we made? And is there anything that in hindsight you feel would have been different? Because I remember, I think, for example, like the name was a big one. The podcast art was another one. Are we going to record on Riverside or record on something else? There's so many like early decisions we made.
Totally. To me, there's one decision that I'm glad that I think we did the right thing, but we could have done really wrong. That I'll get to in a sec. But then all the other decisions, I think they're all reversible. I'm very glad that our approach was, let's move quickly, let's make a decision, and then we can always revisit. And I think that really just gave us the momentum. And what's been cool about this podcast, I feel like it's just been getting more and more momentum. And I think that's been fueling us to do more, to continue going. And I think podcasting is not hard to get started with, but the hardest thing that you have to do with podcast is actually keep going and keep releasing an episode week after week. Because some weeks, Ben and I will have very long weeks, some others might be lighter, but I think releasing that episode on those busier weeks is definitely a challenge sometimes. But yeah, to go back to that big decision that we made that I think was like the right one is a lot of people, when they started a podcast, they record the first season all at once. And we were actually, let's not do that. Let's actually start with one episode, see how it goes, and then learn from that. And I'm so glad we did that for so many reasons. I think one is my first 2 microphones were absolute shit. And it would have been so sad if we recorded 10 episodes with like initial microphone. That would have been like such a bad hit. What are your thoughts on that?
If I remember correctly, we had to re-record our first episode because I think the audio was so bad. And I think that was huge. I also think the first episode was just you and me. And I think that was an awesome conversation. But I think if we had done 10 episodes of just us before discovering, hey, like, what would it be like to have a guest on? That would have completely slowed down our learning curve around what makes for good conversations with guests. And I've really enjoyed the mix of guests and then also these little one-on-one episodes that we do. But I agree. That was a huge decision that we made because I heard from multiple people that like almost everyone you talk to, the common narrative is you should start by recording the first like 3 to 6 episodes before you start publishing any. And then Mark and I were like, okay, if this podcast is a product and we're PMing it, should we wait to ship or should we ship and then start iterating as fast as possible? And I'm glad we made the decision to ship and start iterating because we got a lot of learnings. Like, for example, we found out very early on, I think maybe after 2 or 3 episodes, that the podcast art that we chose had there was like a little creepy hand that was pulling the curtains back. And we got feedback from some of our female listeners that made them uncomfortable. And we're like, that's something we would have never discovered if we just waited forever to record episodes. So we just fixed that immediately when we just made the podcast art cover the hand with people's faces, so that now that was solved, right? Another one was the microphones. So like we got the microphones and the audio setups. Another one is we found that I think maybe 2 or 3 episodes in, there were some background alerts going on for people. And so that allowed us to tell future guests to, hey, turn off your notifications or use like AirPods to do your output. So yeah, I think there's probably dozens of these little adjustments that we've made in the course of the first 10 episodes that if we had waited to start shipping, we probably just wouldn't have been as diligent about. There would be no forcing function for us to make the podcast better. But because we have an audience and a growing audience at that, I'll plug that we just hit 500 subscribers on the Substack, which is an awesome milestone that we should totally celebrate. But now when we release the next episode, there's going to be 500 people that get it in their inbox in addition to all the new people that discover it. And I think that forcing function of building the subscriber list versus starting at 0 when you get to episode 10 just feels like there's momentum at this point.
Yeah. And to me also, like the very energizing part about releasing one at a time is that I get excited then to take the learnings from the previous episode and then implementing it to the new one. That's probably one of the main drivers for consistency. Another big learning for me that I would have not thought about until we started this is, if I think about it, like probably like the highest impact changes that we've made in the podcast have actually been things that we've done before recording, like right before recording or right after recording.
Between the recordings, for sure.
Yeah. Or even, for example, something that I didn't even think about it, but is so important. And I feel like when we've done it, it has led to such a better conversation is, let's say we are scheduled to record at 3 p.m. From 3 p.m. to 3:10, spending the time to just have a small talk or just get to know that guest, right? Make them feel at ease. And also the trick that we started doing with probably around episode 4 or 5 is a trick that we learned from Tim Ferriss, which is basically asking the guest, okay, let's assume that it's 6 months from when we recorded this episode. And this was super successful, right? Like you're so happy you did this. Like, why is that? And I think just channeling that intention, I think one made that person really excited about that future, but also made us aware of like, hey, here are the things that they care about and making sure that we give them an opportunity in the conversation to bring that up.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we actually did this ourselves before this, and we won't cover all the goals we set for this podcast, but one of the ones that I think both of us thought would be part of that intent or intention is if even like one person listening to this feels like they got inspired or something clicked for them to start their own podcast because we shared a little bit of how we do ours, that would be awesome to know. If someone comes up to Mark at a super happy hour and is like, I'm going to start a podcast, or I started a podcast, I'm on episode 5. And thanks to you guys, I got the blueprint for how to get started, or you guys helped me do that. That would be awesome, right? And I think bringing intentionality into the conversations can go a long way.
Yeah.
I also think that our decisions to do episode intros after the conversation was recorded allowed us to go deep right away with the guest versus trying to walk through their whole, like, they already know their background. They don't need to be introduced to themselves, right? The introduction's for the audience. So we started recording the episode intros after the main conversation was recorded, which I think was a big improvement. Also, another huge thing that I thought was awesome that you did in the beginning, Mark, is like, I think after we released a couple episodes, because you used to work at Asana, you're this like Asana ninja, and you created this like template for every episode that includes all of my tasks and all of your tasks. So every time we get a new guest booked, there's a series of tasks that just get created that have to do with like that guest's stuff that both of us just need to do because we're dividing and conquering every episode. And I thought that immediately brought order into the chaos of not knowing what all the tasks even are. And I thought that was huge.
Yeah.
It still is.
Yeah. And by the way, everything that I do, even some personal stuff, like I have like a template for it. The way I think about increasing my capacity is how do I create processes for myself that have to make the least amount of decisions? But also it makes me feel like I'm not going to forget that things are going to fall down the cracks. Like I need something that is bulletproof in that way. And I think it's really nice that when we've booked a guest, we know exactly, hey, like Asana is going to notify me when I have to do this task for publishing. To me, it's feel like it's made it more attainable and easier to manage. We're both very busy, but taking on the podcast has made me I think it's giving me more energy. And I'm able to take some of that energy and bring it into other parts of my work, which is really cool. And in a funny way too, is making me more productive because I feel I have to be very ruthless with my time. So I don't know if you feel that way or not as well.
Yeah. When we book time on the calendar for the pod, I treat that as unmovable. And I think that if I have things I need to get done in a given week and I have a podcast recording in those tasks, then yeah, I kind of forces me to cut the bullshit a little bit with maybe some of the other stuff I spend my time on. And especially between this and a baby and work, like, yeah, time has become very scarce. And I agree with you but I get a lot of energy out of this because I was talking to someone the other day and I think there's something about, I don't know if it's like a PM thing or just like there's a personality type of other roles too, but I just love shipping. And I think that sometimes when you're working on team environments or in company, like I'm working with a company or two right now, and you just can't always ship whenever you want to ship. And I think that from a deep life energy perspective, this podcast has, I think, given both of us an additional thing that we could ship regularly that has like an impact. Like we share screenshots with each other all the time of the feedback that we get from people who listen. And it just feels great to be able to PM and ship something that is not necessarily like a piece of software that has like a bunch of stakeholders and alignment that you need. And
yeah,
that's very energizing.
Yeah, that's such a good point. We both actually publish quite a bit on LinkedIn too. And in a way, when you publish on LinkedIn, it's also a form of shipping. But for some reason, I don't get that exact same energy when I post something on LinkedIn that when I post a podcast. And I'm curious, one, is that also consistent with how you
For
feel?
sure.
And why do you think that is?
I think the impact of a podcast is larger than the impact of a LinkedIn post. So that's why I think it's more energizing. Now, if I double click into that, I think the reasons a podcast feels more impactful and meaningful is because, one, like we're putting our thinking on display live, and we're also bringing other people into the mix. There's people take their busy time to join us, and if like a CEO or a head of product carves out an hour to join us for a conversation, then I actually feel like shipping is not just benefiting me and not just benefiting you, it's benefiting them, and then it's benefiting the audience. So there's like this like splash radius of the content that feels like it is larger than what I can accomplish in a written LinkedIn post. I've certainly had LinkedIn posts that got a lot of reach, but people become like caricatures. Like it's almost like it's all digital. It's not real in that sense. And these conversations are real. If someone listens to one of our podcasts, I'm sure some are better than others to listen to, but they're part of a conversation. And I think there's something deeply meaningful about conversation that flows differently than a one-way post.
I think there's more nuance.
What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, one is there's the depth. Like you can write a very in-depth article on LinkedIn, but you're limited to 10,000 characters. So you can hit a limit there. I think also there's something to dynamic conversations where you're kind of relying on the different participants to go deeper. And I think it's really cool when you go into that journey of you started here and then you see how someone pushes the other person and then you end up in a better place or in a place that's unexpected that maybe you didn't think you'll end up there in the first place. I think there's something really cool about that progression. And then maybe the third piece for me, it's just more fun to ship when you do it with a group of people, right? And where
That's
the
true.
goals are aligned, man. Me and you for sure have our goals aligned, but also it's cool to see when this person that you think like, wow, like they're super busy, they're giving us a favor, but actually like they also want to do this, and it also feels you're helping them. So I think that to me is really energizing. You basically form a new team every episode with 3 people, right? Me and you are the constant, but then we bring in this third person. And maybe that's like connected to like my other learning on why I think people should have podcasts too. I honestly been surprised by how open people are to joining us, right? Like I think we've had very few people that have said no. And I think in general, people just want to get their thoughts out there and also see the value of it. So if you want to have conversations with interesting people, podcast is a great medium to do that.
Yeah, I've heard this probably from multiple podcasts I listen to where the hosts say, I get people to come on the pod who would never talk to me otherwise. And I'm not saying that's true about every one of our guests, but I certainly believe some people wouldn't have taken an hour to just chat one-on-one, but they took an hour to get to come on the pod. And I think that's really valuable. I've just enjoyed the after recording conversations with people too, so in a surprising level. Like after we stopped hitting record, we've actually had some of the most interesting conversations from the pod. I'll throw John Cutler out there because I loved our conversation with him. But after we stopped recording with John, we went on for probably another 30 minutes and just chatted about a bunch of other stuff that we didn't cover. And I was like, man, like I wish we recorded that. So I think that when people come and join the pod, I feel like you're opening the door to them just telling you what they think about things, even if it's more than you bargained for. You're going to learn so much. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's so true. It almost makes me wonder. For context, what we do is in Riverside, you have this button that's record. When you hit stop, and then we continue talking for 30 minutes. But I'm almost thinking we should just have a verbal cue of like, okay, cut, and we just don't pause the recording. Because I totally agree. I don't think there's been any like post recording conversation that we've had that I'm like, oh shit, I wish we hadn't recorded this. Like all of them have been super interesting. I think the other thing that has been super interesting about the post recording conversations is like how open people have been to giving us feedback and how constructive has that feedback been, right? We've had multiple guests being like, hey, like that was cool, but like I think you guys could take it to the next level if you did X, Y, Z. And I think the coolest one was like with Nan, like we actually recorded the episode twice. And I thought that was so cool. He was just like, hey guys, like that was a fun conversation, but based on what we've experienced today, like I think we could even have a better conversation. And 2 days later, we changed it up. We decided to make it more conversational, and it was an amazing episode. So I think that, I don't know. And same with Jeff too, right?
Yeah, we didn't record a part 2 with Jeff, but I think that their feedback was, it's just like when you're doing user research with your product, you look for themes. And I think once you find the themes, that you can start taking action because you're like, okay, it's not just one person, it's like a theme. And I think the theme that we got from the conversation with Nan and with Jeff was that we're trying to cover too much ground. And Mark and I get so excited for these conversations. We want to be really prepared. So we think of some like questions that'll be really interesting to get into. And I think over time, if you were to almost visualize the amount of questions we have, they've been slowly getting smaller and smaller because I think we've been taking the feedback we're hearing and saying, hey, like the goal for the conversations, like the most important thing is to make them interesting and to have fun and to make the guest feel like this was a great use of time, like something they're going to be proud of putting out there. And I think the feedback that we got is that trying to cover too many topics makes the guest feel like they weren't able to go deep on any one topic. And therefore, it feels shallow. And so when we listen to this retrospective, maybe when we get to episode 20, Mark, hopefully at that point, I think we'll both be really happy to be able to look back and say like, we've been able to make the conversations go deeper into a smaller number of things while still fully having fun and exploring our curiosity, but not feeling unnecessary pressure to cover too many topics at a smaller level of depth. And that's like a piece of advice that we're working through now. And I think we're both excited to put that advice into action.
Yeah. Part of it, I think we could have anticipated of people appreciate more depth than breadth. And I think it's hard. You have to be very disciplined, especially when you are interviewing someone that is an expert in a lot of different elements and has a lot of cool things. And you're like, hey, like, I just want to get a little bit of everything. But I think when you do that, you're basically doing a disservice to both the listeners and the guests, because they really don't get to show and demonstrate their expertise and their depth of knowledge on that topic. If I look back, I think the reason why I wanted to ask more questions was like, oh, like, I think the audience is going to really care about these things. So I think I was almost putting a pressure on myself of like, I want to make it really interesting for the audience. But I think a shift that I think might be helpful is like, okay, what am I curious about? And like, how can I keep peeling the onion for myself? Because I want to learn. But I think the point that I missed completely is from the guest perspective. Something that was interesting is like, hey, like actually when I share some of my thinking and then you move to the next thing, it makes me feel like you don't agree with me or like you don't think it's that interesting. So it makes me self-conscious. So then it just creates this cycle where then the person starts to give you shorter answers because they're like not sure if they give you a long answer, if it landed or not. So I think that was super interesting to hear from the other perspective. And then the other thing that was surprising to hear was that the guests also want to hear from us. Something that I think a lot of our guests have in common is that they want to get better and they want to crystallize their thinking. So they would have loved if we push back or if we gave our point of view so they could learn from the experience too, which I thought it was really interesting.
I agree. And I think that with that last part in particular, where the guests wanted to hear more from us, we chewed on that piece of feedback for a couple of days because we're like, is this as like simple as us just telling them before we record that they should feel comfortable asking us questions and passing the ball back to us too? Or is there something more that we should be doing? And I think where we're landing on it is we will definitely tell guests that if there's something we ask about that they would love to get our thoughts about, that they should ask back. But also, if we just feel internally like we have something that we want to share about that, or we have some experience that maps to the topic we're talking about, we should just jump in. It's our show. And if we think we have something we want to add, then we should. And I'm excited to try that because we're not just podcast hosts. We're also like people who have done these jobs. And I think we have our own unique perspectives. And if I put myself in the shoes of the guest, then one of our guests, I'm not going to say who it was, went on another podcast and they told us about this bad experience they had on this other podcast. And we asked them what made it bad. And they said, I didn't understand why I was on this podcast. I just said yes because I thought it would be interesting to do. Maybe it increases their surface area of serendipity, or some unexpected opportunities could come up, or maybe they closed a new customer for their company as a result of going on the pod. So they had their reasons for going there. But when they showed up on the pod, they were like, this doesn't seem like I'm here for a particular reason. There's something this person really wants to talk to me about. And then we just like question, I gave an answer. Next question, I gave an answer. Next question, I gave an answer. And then when they were done, he's like, that was terrible. This was like an awful experience, right? He said ours wasn't like anywhere close to that bad because we were a lot more intentional with like why he was on our show. But I think that's certainly an anti-goal that I would not have thought about before we started doing this, is that this idea of asking a bunch of questions and getting a bunch of answers would be like a failure state from the guest perspective.
Yeah. And I think what you just said too is also really important. A learning of something that we've done well is I don't think we've brought any guests because they're like a big name or have a big following. We've always had a good reason, an intrinsic motivation for why we want to bring that person. Is either we think they're a very interesting original thinker, or we thought that some of their work that they did was really good, or they're friends, or maybe like in my case, we have a lot of really interesting people in Supra that don't have a big platform yet. And I think they'll probably get there at some point. But I think giving the world like a view into, hey, these awesome people, right? And the episode that we had with Andrew and Gaurav, or the episode with Brenton, right? And I'm excited to bring more people because these are folks that have been performing at a really high level for a long time and they have really interesting learnings.
Yeah.
But they haven't been in like that podcast circuit with Lenny, etc. So it's cool to be able to almost be the first ones that share with the world their thought leadership. I think there's something cool about that too.
And this is a very intentional thing we said from the very beginning. The strategy is we want to have a mix of people that we know that, one, we definitely want to talk to, but that also have large followings. And then people who we really want to talk to who are maybe less discovered. And if we could grow the audience by getting more household names, still, again, we haven't compromised our standards for like who we want to talk to, but like people with existing followings or big brand name recognition. Like Nan is an example of someone who should have way more awareness around him because he's freaking incredible. He's just starting his journey of building his public persona, right? But being able to get like the head of product at Linear on the pod drove a lot of views, and now those people join the podcast. So when we bring someone who is maybe less known and we give them their own episode or we feature them in an episode, there's gonna be way more eyeballs in that episode. So I think as long as we can keep growing the podcast by getting distribution and then also plugging people in who don't have their own distribution and just balancing that act. I've been describing it to people as we're trying to create an API into the Supra community through the podcast. There's a bunch of really interesting stuff that happens inside of Supra that I see because I'm in it. And I know that people outside of the community don't see it. And I think that one of our original goals in starting this was to provide that. You called it a window. But how do we not only give people on the outside a peek in, but how do we also use this podcast to help the people that are in it get more of their own platform and distribution?
Yeah, that's very well said. And maybe, a question that would be fun to debate now is we wanted to find people that we think are interesting and that have a big audience, right? And the thinking there was like, if they have a big audience, they're going to reshare the podcast with their 100K followers on LinkedIn. And then that's going to help get more subscribers, which then will help, as you were describing. And I always thought that the episodes that we brought on those people that have bigger followings would actually have the most amount of listens. But a learning that I've had, and I've been looking at the data pretty closely, is that, yes, I think overall the people that have a bigger following do have maybe like 20% more or like 30% more listens than the rest. But actually, like some of the most listened episodes are from people that don't have that big of an audience, but they cover topics that are super relevant and very top of mind for product leaders. I like negotiation or how to navigate the current market. So maybe we're putting too much weight into people's audiences rather than the topics or the areas of expertise that they're known for.
Well, I think we overestimated the impact that the follower base of the guests would have on our ability to get more subscribers for the pod. And I think we underestimated some other growth hacks that we've been doing and how those move the needle. So like specifically, you discovered an opportunity that I think has paid a lot of dividends where because you're so plugged into the product community through Supra and you're seeing a lot of opportunities pop up for product leadership roles, a director at a company or a group PM somewhere, you started aggregating these job postings into not just LinkedIn posts, but now you let people also subscribe to get these job opportunities in their inbox. And you discovered that if someone subscribes to that newsletter that has those job postings, and we could also let them know that there's this podcast that they could listen to, that a lot of them end up subscribing to get the podcast. And I think that's something that would have been impossible for us to plan up front.
Totally.
But I do think that those types of like smart distribution plays have had an outsized impact on the growth of the podcast reach relative to maybe having some very high visibility guests on the pod, which is good to know. And so I think that's a very long way of saying I do think that the most important thing at this point is the content. And I think as long as the content is really good and people find the conversations valuable and they look forward to getting the next episode, then just like any other product, I think people might talk about it to other people, they might share it, but most importantly, they'll keep listening. And I think that's going to tell the algorithms for Spotify and other platforms that this might be something that people would find more value in, so we should promote it.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. I think maybe the one thing that it does help to bring like those more well-known people is the social proof, right? If like you're trying to bring another person, be like, hey, like these are the list of people that have already come in. So by justifying that someone else has come, maybe it's also a good use of your time. And yeah, maybe another thing that, I don't know, I'm curious to get your thoughts too, but has been frustrating for me throughout this entire process is how shitty podcast analytics are.
Yeah.
It's so hard to know what's going on. So what you can do is you can like number of listeners, how much of the podcast have they listened, but like you have no idea how is their retention. Are people like listening more than one episode? Which I don't know, I consider myself like an analytical, data-driven PM, has been frustrating. And maybe that goes to another theme of it's hard to get constructive feedback for the podcast unless you're asking the guests right after. I think that's like the only kind of constructive feedback, or very close friends that you ask them, be like, hey, like, what did you think of this episode? Like in the beginning, I think we both were sharing with friends, be like, hey, what did you think of this? And we actually got a lot of detailed, like, not harsh, but be like, hey, like this could be a lot better. But I think now I'm craving more of that. So I think that's why I love those post-recording calls. But I'm like, ooh, I wish I could just do that more at scale. And I just feel like I don't have a way to do that.
This has been an unsolved problem for so long, and started a podcast a couple times over the years. This is definitely the one that I've stuck with the longest, and I think it's on a really good trajectory. The analytics problem has always been an issue, and I think it fundamentally boils down to RSS feeds. And like the product is essentially an RSS feed, and you're distributing this RSS feed through different clients, and each of the clients could give you some of their own analytics. Like we publish on Substack, and every episode that we publish on Substack automatically flows into Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And then we separately post the video of every conversation into YouTube. And then we make posts that are making people aware about the podcast through the Substack newsletter. And then we promote it on LinkedIn and posts. And so there's a bunch of different places that people could find it. And when they do find it, they could go listen in different, like YouTube people don't show up to us in the analytics in the same place as like Substack people, and they don't show up as Apple and Spotify. So I agree with you. It's almost like we're back in the early days of the internet where you really had to like piece together a bunch of just snapshots of information, but there wasn't any unified way of viewing it. But I think what I like about our approach is that we haven't been obsessed about numbers. We don't have goals. We don't have external stakeholders that are like forcing us to do anything. One of the decisions we actually made was to not, I'm not going to name the platform, but there was a platform out there that we were like, hey, should we potentially run this podcast under the umbrella of this other platform that's going to bring its own distribution and it's going to lend credibility?
Yeah,
and
maybe to clarify,
we said no, like let's not do that.
Platform might be confusing here, but maybe more of like a media arm, basically like a media company that.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. And we decided not to do that because I think we wanted to have full ownership. And I think my point is that we're not getting hung up on precision and goals and measuring stuff as long as we feel like directionally things are getting better every episode. And I think they certainly are.
Yeah.
And it's growing,
totally,
objectively speaking.
Yeah, I'm very glad we haven't set goals for ourselves because I think that would take the fun out of it. I think there's been like something really nice about not having goals and implicit or subjective expectations. And then it's nice when you're surprised about the progress, right? Or you're like, oh, I had no idea this was possible.
I think our goal that I like the most is we want to be consistent with publishing.
Yeah.
Right? That goal, honestly, it's enough work to do that.
For sure.
And that's, the score is going to take care of itself, is something we've talked about. So I love that goal. And I think the goal is literally always actionable on a daily basis. Are we on track to like ship again this week or next week?
Absolutely. Yeah, maybe it might be fun to talk about. Is there anything that we want to do differently in the next 4 or 5 months? What are we excited about?
I have a couple, and then I'm actually curious what you're thinking. So one that we've talked about is we've talked about how it might be fun to do one of these in person, or maybe multiple of these in person. You certainly see like guys like Lex Friedman, Joe Rogan. There are people out there that seem to just like have a rule that they don't do digital podcasts. And my guess is it's because it's more fun and more real to do things in person. And we're in New York. It's not like we're in some random place. So like we certainly have enough people in New York that if we did want to do this in person and we figured out some kind of studio setup that was quiet and facilitated good discussions consistently, like it probably would be fun to run that test at some point and just see how it feels differently. So that's one. Then I think just more of these kind of things we're doing right now. We didn't know we were going to be having this conversation 2 weeks ago. This is something that we just come up with an idea and we're like, yeah, that sounds interesting and fun. Let's do it. So I would just say keep experimenting with stuff that seems interesting for us. We've toyed with the idea of maybe taking some content that is being recorded within the Supra community and maybe using the podcast as a mechanism for distributing that content, getting it more reach. So I think that would be interesting to test around at some point. But yeah, what about you? Like any things that you want to see us do either more of, less of, differently?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first one is to continue on that journey of focus. I'm really curious if like we can get to a point where we have a guest and we just have like just one question or one topic, and we're actually able to stick to it and to reach a level of depth that we're like, wow, like everyone in the call learned something. I think the other one that I'm excited to do is it is a good amount of work to get every podcast out, right? Like we do some prep, right? We do some coordination with the guest. We edit like it's not like we hit record and then we publish. Like we actually spend probably twice as much of the, like if an episode is an hour, we probably spend 2 hours editing, right? Because we have to re-listen, cutting, making sure that everything's clean, and then finding the sound bites, then uploading to Subtask, YouTube, writing the post and writing the LinkedIn post. So it's probably like at least 10 hours of work that we're doing combined. I would like us to see how can we start to operate more in our zone of genius and delegate the stuff that maybe we don't enjoy as much, and maybe that even gives us more energy and creates more space for us to do things that we hadn't thought about. So I think that's like figure out like what parts can we delegate and which parts can we not. And that I'm excited about, and I'm Supra is getting bigger in terms of team size, so hopefully we can delegate some of that to someone in Supra. So that's something that I'm excited to be and find that nice balance. I totally agree with you. I think it would be super cool if we can get someone in person. I don't know what will be the outcome, but I just have curiosity. Like, is it going to be like 10 times better? Is it going to be more fun? Who knows? Yeah. And I think maybe the last part is I really love when I get feedback from the audience, the community. So I think either finding a way to engage with our audience, either them letting us know, hey, like we care about this topic, you figure out what's that subtopic that matters, and then find the right person to have that conversation. Any reactions to those?
No, I think that's spot on. And if someone does want to give feedback, I think what's really helpful is I almost think of it like back to our episode with Jeff that we released recently, the CEO of Grain, and he talked about how recording internal meetings can be really helpful, or customer interviews can be really helpful because you can get like feedback from people on, hey, like this might have been an area that's worth digging into more. This was an opportunity to ask a follow-up question. So Mark and I are trying to get better at this craft, right? Like of interviewing people and having engaging conversations. And if you ever reach a point where you're listening and you're like, oh man, I really like wish they dug on that more, or I thought that would be more interesting, that's super actionable feedback for us that will help us get better, kind of being the kinds of interviewers that would create better content that's more, I don't know, interesting to listen to, more meaningful. So that's certainly great feedback. The one thing we didn't talk about, which I do really like as a decision we make, which is just why not? We found this product, I forget what it's called, to make the social media clips that are automatically
Opus Clip.
Opus Clip. Yeah. Awesome tool. Mark and I, before we publish, he generates a few clips when he's doing the editing from Descript, and then we discuss which of those we think is most interesting. And then we provide those clips as resources to guests along with the blurb so that they can share it if they're interested. And we actually found that our definition of what a good clip is sometimes different than what the guest thinks the better clip is. And that's another learning is we decided to go from just giving them one clip that we thought was the best one to giving them a few that we think are good, and they can pick which one they like from that. And I think that's been another very guest-friendly decision that we made that I'm proud of.
The process that we've been following is basically one of us will edit the podcast, then the other one will review it, make sure that everything's good, then we'll agree on like, hey, here we'll share like 6 clips that we thought, hey, these are awesome. Usually we try to keep them within a minute because it's a trailer, right? We want people to be like, cool, that was like really cool clip. I want to listen to the whole thing, but also not long enough that we lost people. So we decided that. And then after that, what we've been doing to try to increase more, a bigger following on our Substack and on other platforms too, is like, so we usually post on Tuesdays. So on Mondays, we'll release one of the clips, and then it'll be, hey, like if you want to receive this, subscribe to our Substack to receive it tomorrow. To be honest, I thought that was going to drive more engagement. Like I think we've done it 2 times. I think one of them gave us like 10 followers. The other one gave us 20, which is not bad. Still, like that's like close to 7% given our current size. And also on that Monday, we'll share the clips with the guests and also a blurb that we already pre-written. And like the thinking there is we basically don't want them to repost our LinkedIn post because we found that leads to less impressions, less engagement. So we basically what we try to do is encourage them. It'd be awesome if you created your standalone post. And then we share like a Google Drive folder with 3 clips, and then we don't tell them which one to use, but hey, whichever one speaks most to you, you can use. And yeah, I think that process has been going well. I think what a lot of podcasters do that we don't do is they usually will first send the edited version to the guest. They'll get a chance to review it, and then they'll, if they have any edits, they'll let us know. We honestly just haven't been done that for 2 reasons. I think one is we're only recording 1 episode per week, so we don't have the luxury to kind of wait for the iteration and then post. Like we need to move quicker. And then also, no one has told us that we need to. So I think if we can keep going that way, I think it just feels faster and snappier.
That's kind of funny that became a standard, right? Like a standard expectations, like you have to send it to the guest before you publish, but why? Right? It doesn't seem like we have been able to find first principles reasons that we need to do that.
Yeah, my thinking is that we're still small, so maybe 500 people is not on a scary audience, but if you're, let's say, like Lenny's podcast, you're maybe getting exposed to like close to 1 million people. So maybe at that point, you want to be a little bit more careful of what you say, but that's the only reason that I can think of.
Yeah, I think that's actually been a competitive advantage of ours. Not that we're competing with anyone, but from a guest experience perspective, to know that you can come on the podcast on like a Wednesday and then by Tuesday, the thing is live. In my experience, that's like an abnormal turnaround time for doing content. So if someone's listening and you're like, do I want to be on a podcast? Trust me, some podcasts you go on it. I've been on some podcasts like months ago that still haven't published.
Yeah.
Right. No. I don't know what they're doing, but it's not their priority to publish. And maybe they're waiting, they're stockpiling content. And actually, this happened to me 2 years ago. I was on a podcast and it took 4 months for the episode to air, which is wild.
Yeah.
If you come on our podcast, the episode's going to be live the following week, guaranteed. Like that's like people can expect that. We don't mess around. And I think that is probably going to be helpful for us to continue securing really high quality guests to be able to offer that kind of turnaround time.
Something that we hadn't talked about, but I think that makes podcasting such a powerful medium is that in a way, it's probably the most useful type of content to have, for both for us and for the guest, because it's the only medium that you can turn into anything that you want, right? Like you can turn a podcast into a video clip, you can turn a podcast into a long form newsletter, you can turn it into a quick tweet, you can turn it into
LinkedIn post,
TikTok, etc. Yeah. So we haven't really thought much about what else we want to do with the content, but I think that's something that it'd be interesting to explore, because I think we are seeing a lot of really good content.
Yeah, I agree. I think that if someone recently subscribed and you've only listened to the last few episodes while we're talking about the content, I would encourage you to go back and listen to some of the previous episodes. They're really good, and maybe you haven't been notified about them yet, but there's some good stuff in there. And yeah, there's no shortage of opportunities, and I don't think we're closing any doors by just continuing to create great content, and we'll figure out what to do with it later. But yeah, I just want to say a huge thank you, Mark, for doing this with me and for, I think, putting a ton of work into making this podcast successful. I think you've been a really fun thought partner to discuss all these different experiments and keep chewing on the feedback together. And I think there's a saying that's like, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. Like I've been feeling that togetherness as we've been doing this, and it's been awesome. And so I'm just like really excited to keep doing it.
Right back at you, man. I've been building Supra on my own, which can get very lonely, and it's been such a breath of fresh air working on this together. And I think what I really appreciate about you, Ben, is that, as you said, you're a shipper. I think you are someone that inherently just biased for action. When you're faced between like, oh, let's think about it or let's just do it, you have that energy of like, let's just do it, see what happens. And I think the other thing that I think has been really helpful too is that I think you're just very curious. And I think every time we'll have an idea, and instead of just sitting on the idea, I'll be like, should we just try it, right? Like, for example, like with the recording the Nan episode, you were just like, hey, Nan, like, this, a lot of people would have thought like, this is like crazy ass, dude. How's this guy who's the head of product at Linear to he already gave us a week of his time to come back the next day and record for an hour. But you're like, yeah, but you might as well just try it. You're definitely not afraid to take shots, and a lot of times they pay out. So it's been really fun to learn from you and push myself to do more of that. And yeah, and then finally too, I also just want to give a big thank you to everyone who listens. This has exceeded my expectations of people that are tuning in every week, that listen to the podcast, that have been patient with our learning curve. And I'm personally excited to continue getting better and delivering more value for everyone.
And while we're on the note of thank yous, thank you to all the guests, people that have been so generous with your time to come and talk to us. And we've really appreciated it. We wouldn't really have the energy that we have to keep doing this if we didn't have awesome guests. So I just want to say a huge thank you to the people that took the time. And I'm excited to maybe start getting some round twos with some of our early guests also scheduled, because I know we could have kept talking to them about a lot more. So
yeah, it'd be really cool to have the friends of the pod that come on a consistently basis, and people get to know them too. Like, I think that'd be a nice goal as well. Yeah,
we can do it. Let's test it.
Nice, man.
We can do it. There's nothing stopping us.
Well, this is a really fun episode. I'm really glad we did this, and I'm super curious to see what people think.
Me too. All right. Well, see you all next time. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with someone who you think would benefit from it as well. We really appreciate it. We'd also love a follow or a rating on Substack, Spotify, or YouTube. That's going to let other people find us. And if you have any topic recommendations for a future episode, please send myself or Mark a DM on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks.